Hello, you're listening to the d.MBA podcast where we share business confidence for designers. My name is Alan. I am a business designer and founder of the d.MBA. And today with me is Franz, program director at also d.MBA. Say hi and wave, Franz.
Hi, everyone.
And so you're listening to another business design jam where we take maybe current business news, maybe something we currently find interesting in the business ecosystem. And we try to see how it's relevant for the business and design world. And today's topic is something I think is close to a lot of designers. I wouldn't say heart, but at least like a thinking process. So we're going to talk about pollution, environment, and more specifically, the carbon offsets. Yeah.
Correct.
So, the reason we've been talking about this topic is because lately I've seen a lot of commercials and even on packaging of the products, I've seen these claims that, hey, this product is, I believe they call it net. Let me just check.
Net zero.
Exactly. Yeah. Carbon footprint is net zero. And the way it's even communicated, it tells you like, okay, it doesn't say it's zero, it's net zero. So obviously I was intrigued. My assumption is they still pollute, but they have to somehow offset it. So that's how they do it. But it was an interesting rabbit hole to go through this, let's say, not just news, but also like the whole industry that is building on top of these carbon offsets. So have you, Franz, ever seen these commercials with the net footprint being net zero? Yeah,
I have, and I bought a product. I will share it later. But I have also bought offsets myself, right? You can click on offset the CO2 of this delivery or offset the CO2 of this flight. I've done this.
And just to get a sense for it for the listeners, what's the usually like the price of these offsets? Like if you fly,
I think I offset my flight from Milan to Berlin for €2 something. So not something that you really think about when you're like, hey, I can make up for what I'm polluting with my travels, and it's €2. Yeah, you chip it in. You don't really think about it until us basically encountering so many products with being net zero or carbon neutral, and then you start reading about it and then maybe reconsidering what you're doing there with this click.
Exactly. And €2 is such a low number that it just makes you think like, what's going on here? It feels like a little bit just of marketing and that it can't really be true. But is it? Let's see. So first, maybe let's just define what carbon offsets are, just to lay the foundation for this conversation. So carbon offsets are basically some kind of, let's call it credits or a certain type of products or services that companies can buy to fictively basically decrease their carbon footprint. So this company can still be increasing their pollution, but they can simply be offsetting this by buying credits from companies that offer these carbon offset products. And that's actually completely fine. Like I think the idea is very noble and great. If you can actually offset your pollution, why not do it, right? So it's no wonder that a lot of companies are jumping onto this bandwagon. I think it's not just from the marketing perspective, which is also very good, but also from the perspective of, it's just the right thing to do. But we'll get into the crux of this whole story a little bit later because you will see that it's not as easy as we're maybe led to believe that it is. So that's basically what a carbon offset is. So maybe just to check within Franz, is there anything maybe I forgot to mention here?
I do think that we need a little bit more detail to understand that. Because in a way, like briefly defining it, it makes sense, right? You're buying a credit. You have a balance of CO2 that you're emitting. and you're buying a credit, and this credit means that somebody else lowered the CO2 emission or stored CO2 somewhere, and you buy this credit and you pay them for doing this, which means that you can deduct this number of pollution from your let's say balance sheet, emission balance sheet. But I think it does make sense to go a little bit into the two systems of that. So this compliance market, compliance carbon offset market, and the voluntary offset market, or also called free carbon offset market.
Yeah, for sure. I'll go into both of these. But maybe even before we go into this, maybe just to explain this definition even further, like what are these companies that are offering offsets? What are they even doing? I think that's also an interesting thing to talk about. I think we'll go deeper into this, but just for you to get a sense, these are projects like maybe avoiding deforestation, maybe reforestation, sometimes capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and so on. So basically any type of project that could or that can basically offset or turn carbon dioxide into something more healthy for the environment. Okay, but now in terms of how this can work, as you said, Franz, there are two systems. One is more connected with compliance, which is like government intervention. So government stepping in and saying, hey, we need to find a way to reduce pollution. And another one is there are certain companies that just voluntarily go into offsetting their carbon emission. So the first one is this, let's say, the government intervention. And let's maybe just spend a few minutes here. So what a lot of governments are doing these days, they've signed these treaties. They're just trying to reduce the pollution. And they find certain industries that are polluting a lot, and they focus on those as the first stepping stone. So, and a really famous system in trying to do this for governments is called cap and trade. So basically they define how much emissions certain industry can emit, and then they basically divide that number with all the factories or companies within this industry. And then each of them gets carbon credits. It may be that all of them get the same amount. It may be that also this varies. It really depends on the industry and the government and so on. But the thing is that each company gets their credits, and then basically they need to emit less, or exactly as defined in the cap. So the cap is how much you can emit. But actually you can also trade these, let's call them credits. So if one factory is emitting more and another one is emitting less, the one emitting less can actually sell their credits to another companies. And this may sound familiar because you may have heard that Tesla is making more money with selling these credits than it actually from making cars. And that's just one example, and there's plenty of them. And this is happening with many industries. So one, automotive is just one of them. But it really depends on just governments in different countries stepping up and actually doing it. Yeah. Sorry, did you want to add something to this?
No, just wanted to, confirm, like, I think that some countries even auction this. So basically, companies of an industry need to buy their credits, which is basically a right to pollute, a certain amount of CO2. And then, as you said, trade it. So, or at least they need to, let's go to the short term, right? Short term is, as a country, you want to cap the amount of CO2 that is actually emitted to the atmosphere, meaning that, okay, you will let people buy or give people these credits, and if they get below, they can sell these credits. If they surplus this without having bought credits, then they need to pay a fine or need to pay taxes on that, right? Yeah, there are penalties or carbon tax, etc. Yeah, I think one thing I forgot to mention is that the idea of the cap and trade is that each year or a certain time frame, the government is reducing the cap. If this year they can do 1 unit, maybe next year they can do just 19% of this. And the big overall idea here is that these companies have an incentive and time to basically transition to a more green technology. Yeah, we're basically creating a market where supply of something is reduced step by step, right? So government lowers the number of permits each year. This means that we have lower supply of the emissions that are allowed to make, which means that lower supply always means higher price. So if you do emit more, this gets more and more expensive over time because you need to buy more of these credits for a higher price, which means over time that companies have more incentive to reduce their emissions, and it's more, there's just more return on investment when you actually invest in clean technology, which is reducing your emissions rather than buying the permit to pollute, basically. So this is the whole idea behind that, creating a market that has lower and lower supply over time, so it gets basically more expensive to pollute. And in the end, you have to admit this is a good idea, right? It makes sense to apply this system. It logically works.
It logically works, but in practice right now it doesn't work, exactly for the reason that you brought up, which is like when you emit more, you have to pay these penalties, and these penalties are still much lower than the actual benefit these companies get from actually polluting. So at the moment it's not working. And like also part of this system and part of this problem is that in certain countries, like you can try to avoid this carbon tax by moving your production elsewhere where you don't have these cap and trade, and that these taxes, if they have them, also different governments have different price of these. So there's just too many loopholes for this to work at the moment. That's kind of the sad part of it.
I completely agree. I mean, there are these, like, the idea behind it absolutely makes sense, but there is like cracks everywhere, right? So caps being set too high in the first place. So this initial right to pollute, many scientists say this is already too high. Then, as you said, fines just being too low. So you're basically just better off paying fines than to actually buy your credits or actually invest in clean technology. So that's definitely an incentive problem here. And also, I think monitoring is just still hard. This is a thin ice here. We're not like scientists in this part, but
or experts.
What I read is or experts, exactly. What I read is just that it's really, really hard to monitor and measure how much CO2 a company actually blows into the air, right? This is not like, there is no balance sheet in a sense that you have a revenue report and a CO2 report, right?
Yeah.
So that's just really hard to measure. So while there are some cracks, I think there are still many countries who go into this direction, right? European Union trading system. So we do have industries in like energy production, these oil, steel works, aluminum production, cement production, paper production, all of these high energy industries, and obviously also aviation, who have these cap and trade systems. And I think recently China introduced one, and also the UK has an independent one as of the Brexit. So we see many countries going into this direction, but I mean, it's early, right? I mean, early. It's not early. It's actually very late.
Yeah. But early in the sense of introducing these systems.
Correct.
Even though actually...
And I think they are...
Sorry, go ahead.
I think they are being like... they are trying to make this better. And I honestly believe that the cap and trade system, if done in like thoughtfully, I think that does make sense, honestly.
For sure, and we've seen it work. That's why it's even been introduced to CO2, to carbon dioxide, because in the 1990s, the cap and trade was tried for the first time in the US for the, I think, sulfur dioxide. So another very, very bad pollutant, which caused things like acid rain. And the US was basically, in a few years, not completely eradicated, but just decrease the pollution with the sulfur dioxide enough so that acid rain become much less of a problem. So this system, cap and trade, has shown its success in a way. So maybe it just needs to be implemented differently. But in the business is like an incentive game. In the end of the day, like countries also trying to compete against each other. So you don't want to hamper your industry too much. Like if you look from the perspective of Germany, like the whole country or a big part of the country is built on automotive companies. So why would now they go and then try to harm these companies that just do a lot of quote unquote well for the society? I mean, so you kind of also as a country need to balance these things, and that's why we are here where we are, because some countries are trying to go out of this system, like we had US jumping out of the Paris Agreement, and so on. So while this is like, it looks bleak on the compliance side, hopefully it's going to change soon. It does look more promising on the voluntary side, or does it? So
voluntary is always good, right? Companies come in and they reduce their emissions and they want to be carbon neutral. So that's awesome, right?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about it. So let's just maybe explain it a little bit more. So the voluntary system basically means that a company is not by any regulation in a position that they need to offset the pollution they're making. So think about companies like Apple, Amazon, and so on. So they don't have any like regulations at the moment yet, but they just engage in voluntary carbon offset. Reasons could be different. It could be pressure from, I don't know, customers, from the media, maybe employees, and so on. But actually, the reasons don't even matter as much as we make progress, I would say. The problem with this is that a lot of these projects that we mentioned before, so avoiding deforestation, reforestation, capturing carbon dioxide, there is plenty more like things in agriculture and so on. Also investing in renewable energy. The problem is that when you buy these voluntary carbon offsets, what you're actually buying is a promise. It's a promise that this project you're investing in, because you're basically investing in a certain project, let's say it's reforestation of a certain area, you're buying into the promise of that company doing that reforestation that they will offset this much carbon in the future. So this can happen, but a lot of research has shown that actually these projects do not meet their criteria. And that's where even the voluntary system has a lot of these problems. Yeah.
I think here we briefly need to go in the difference between this compliance offset market and this voluntary offset market, right? So the compliance offset market just means that you get a cap. Let's say you are allowed 100 credits of pollution. I can say better, like you get 100 credits and you kind of need to hit this goal of 100 credits, right? And you can either hit it by not polluting more than these 100 credits, or you can reach it by buying credits from somebody else. So you have 120 credits, for example. Good. So that's the whole goal, right? You're meeting a government regulation, a cap. For this voluntary carbon offset market, the goal is a little bit different, right? So these companies, they want to reduce their carbon footprint. And this overall goal is like, we want to be net zero. We want to be carbon neutral by the year 2030 or by the year 2050. So what companies say is that they will reduce emissions as far as they can. And for the emissions they cannot avoid, they will offset it. And now we're back, right? So in this case, they buy carbon credits by investing into something that is supposed to make up for the pollution that this company still make it. So they invest in projects that take carbon emissions out of the air. So they invest in planting trees. They're investing in a wind park that takes off a coal plant from the power from the network, right? So this is the whole thing. You're paying somebody for taking carbon out of the air that you actually do pollute. So, and every one of these projects is directly connected to a specific quantity of greenhouse gas emissions. So, at least on paper, right? So you're paying somebody else to reduce the emissions or take the CO2 out of the air while you're blowing it into the air.
Exactly. So that's where the claim of we're going to be net zero comes from. So these companies are looking at, okay, this is the CO2 our production and all of our operations, including distribution, creates, that we're just going to buy enough of these carbon offsets from companies doing offset projects that we will be neutral. That doesn't mean that they actually didn't pollute, which is still very noble. I think at the end of the day, like it's the right way to think. Also, the right way to think is to reduce. But at the first stage, I think, companies need some time to change their business models while being competitive, etc. So it is a noble idea. It's the implementation that's tricky.
And it is even an idea that does work again in logic. So before we actually go into the problems again, I do want to stress that this in general makes sense, because carbon emission and climate change or climate crisis is a global problem. So it doesn't matter who reduces emissions. It just matters that emissions are reduced globally. And trading just makes sense here, right? Because some countries or industries have just a much harder job to reduce emissions than others. So let's say you could have a steel plant that's heavily emitting CO2 and is very capital intensive, and it's really hard to make that green in the short term. So obviously it makes sense for this company to pay for a forest to be planted to offset some of the CO2 this company produces in the short term, right? I'm not talking steel plants should just go on and on and on. I'm just saying for the short term, this does make sense until the steel plant can also be greener. Or other example, like a country that already has most of its energy coming from renewable resources, they could or do actually with this system pay another country which is still relying heavily on energy from coal example, for example, that they build a wind park and shut down a coal plant. So this country that already has that is already further in their development with regards to renewable resources, they would have a much harder time, and it would be much more expensive for them to save something. Whereas in another part of the world, it would be much cheaper to save it. And if that works, that's awesome. And it absolutely makes sense. But it doesn't work. Because, I mean, now we're getting to this, maybe also a little bit rant part, right? So this is why this whole system that you can buy credits and this credit actually gets deducted from your balance of emission leads to being carbon neutral and net zero, even if you're still polluting. And this leads to this weird situation that huge companies, which are obviously polluting heavily, are net zero. Ironically, Shell has the claim to be net zero in carbon and CO2 emission by 2050. And this is where the whole thing is really, really hard. And that's why I bought an engine oil from Castrol that has the claim carbon neutral on the box. Like,
you know what I'm wondering, like, how did Shell calculate their carbon footprint? Was it, this is how much we are polluting while extracting oil, which is their business, or this is how much we are polluting while extracting oil and then oil being used in engines? This is an additional.
No, that's on you.
Yeah, right.
Because you are driving.
I mean, I'm not sure, but it's something I would call double dip. So, I mean, they would have to pay for both in a way. But, I mean, I also get the claim that, no, we just pay our part for extracting the oil. But then if you are driving a car, you should pay for your part. But it's still like, it's a funny story.
Actually, this is almost like when you look more closely, it almost gets devastating because it's like, it seems to be something that is so easy to do. So when you think of this whole thing now is that there's just so much cracks when you look at this closely, right? So I don't know. You already mentioned this this principle of additionality, did you?
Externality or
no additionality. Okay,
no,
you didn't mention
no.
apparently. So this offsetting is based on additionality. So this project, so there is a project developer, right? This project developer sets up an offset project. Then you have a standard body, and this standard body basically signs it off, says, okay, yes, that works. It has so much carbon credits, and it's and yes, you can sell this as a project. Then you have brokers, and these brokers, they trade these credits, and then you have the buyers who buy the credits, like companies who want to be net zero. Thing is that all of this offset only works if this is additional effort. And this is this principle of additionality, right? So you need to do something, this project needs to do something that wouldn't have been done otherwise. So you would have to build a wind park that wouldn't have been built otherwise. Mm-hmm. You would have to plant a tree that wouldn't have been planted otherwise. You would have to save a forest that otherwise would have been cut down. And this is where you need to, like, I don't know, like watch into people's brains. Right?
Yeah.
So would this forest have been cut down, or is this just making money for somebody who says, I would have cut this forest down if you don't pay me for it?
You know what I've even heard about? Like, it's a story where a company paid the carbon offset to another company to plant trees, which they did. They planted trees. But then a few years later, like a year or 2 years later, those trees were cut down again. So, yeah, we did plant them, but then we didn't follow through by keeping them planted. So it's also this, like, even if you do something additional, you need to sustain it for long enough to have benefits.
Yeah. So this, I mean, there was recently a piece from Last Week Tonight, John Oliver, where they found that somebody said they would save this forest from being cut down and sold this as a carbon offset project. And this was basically a forest of a billionaire's hunting club, who was obviously not going to cut down these trees because that's a hunting club. What are you going to do with a hunting club without trees? So so this is just, I think obviously we cannot generalize everything, but I'm just saying that this principle of additionality is just really, really hard to measure, because are you now really with your investment making a wind park happen, or are you more like investing in a wind park that would have been built in any case? Right? So this offset can only work if it's pure additionality, right? You are paying something for something that would have not happened at all, and this takes exactly the same amount of CO2 out of the energy or saves this, then you pollute. And this logic is nice, but how?
It's very hard to prove.
Yeah.
And what did you... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I wanted to ask you if you found anything interesting about the size of this industry, of the carbon offset industry.
I actually did. And that's another factor that's super interesting, right? So if we talk about, I don't know, 1 out of 5 companies that want to be carbon neutral by this and that date, if we look at all of these claims of where I can offset my flight, where I can buy carbon neutral project, you would assume that this is a huge market, right? But this market is like, I'm not talking about a voluntary carbon offset market. 2021 was 1 billion. That may sound now high, but actually this is tiny. Because when you compare this, so you know that I talked about this engine oil, that was from Castrol, and Castrol is part of BP. And BP has a revenue of $164 billion.
That's British petrol, right?
Yes. So
just as another data
the offset market is 1 billion, whereas like one single company that is one of the biggest polluters of the world has 146 times more revenue, and that's only one company. So alone, this is like weird. Like, how can I buy a carbon neutral product while this market is so small? I would have assumed this is huge, because obviously it costs money to do all these projects to set off to offset emissions, but apparently it's not big when you compare it.
That's really surprising, yeah, because even Apple has like 300 plus billion in revenue. So just to put it in perspective, 1 billion in the streets, it's tiny, you know, it's really tiny. But I'm guessing it's growing very fast.
I mean, with all these claims of companies wanting to be net zero by 2030, 2050, McKinsey says that this is going to be a $50 billion market in 2030.
Okay.
Others say that even goes to like 120 billion by the half of the century, like 2050. So obviously it's growing, but as we can see now, it's really growing weirdly with projects that can't really deliver. I mean, we have already talked about this project, right? So these problems. First one was this additionality is really hard to measure. Then these offsets, we have also talked about these are weirdly cheap. So there is really little incentive to reduce your emission. You can rather just offset it, right? It's much easier. It's much cheaper. Then these projects often don't deliver, like forests. You can build a forest, you can plant the forest with your best intention, but if it, with current droughts, burns down after 5 years, it's still offset, right? This company still got their benefits and it was still net zero. And in the end, even if this all would work, it would still not solve the problem, because the projects that are mostly done at the moment is planting trees. And there is simply not enough space to plant the trees that we need to offset everything that we blow into the air, right? So even if everything would work, that's still not a solution. So at the moment, this offsetting program, especially this voluntary offsetting programs, they're actually worse than if we didn't have it, because if you can't pollute and the offset is cheap or even complete nonsense, then we just basically increase pollution and make it worse.
Yeah, because and make you feel good
lie
about
to ourselves and to lie to ourselves and to consumers that we are net neutral and we can fly by just chipping into euros.
Yeah, it's another case of how do we measure this better, right? So as we had the problem with the government imposed regulation with the cap and trade system, how do we measure pollution? Here we have the problem with how do we measure the success of these projects. And maybe to close this section on a more positive note, like there is some research out there, like what type of these carbon offset projects apparently have the biggest impact, and what is consistently coming on top is just renewable energy. So basically trying to invest into renewable energy projects. As you said, forestation, so planting trees is kind of towards the bottom of this list. So building just a different type of energy future for tomorrow. So hopefully, like in my mind, hopefully this is just the start or a clumsy start into something promising, something that could, if we have credible and good players, good companies in this space, can take off in a good way. And we just get, we can, with the current business models of these companies, finance the future, which should be kind of the way to do it. Plus impose some stricter rules on them to cut it faster. And it's a growing market. So if anybody is interested in founding something, I think there is a potential there for doing better than how it's currently done. When I was reading this, I got a feeling that this is a much better company at this stage to start in a Web3 or crypto. As ridiculous as it sounds, like these companies, so companies trying to offset their carbon footprint, they are just like, there's not enough projects for them to offset their pollution. So if you are in this, like an engineer or have an idea for something like this, this is now the time to try out and build something here, because there's plenty of money that's pouring into this industry.
Yeah. And credibility is like the thing here, because we were ranting for, I don't know, 15 minutes about how hard it is to have additionality and how hard it is to measure pollution or savings. So that's definitely something that is a huge opportunity if we could solve this, measuring and really consistently and in high quality measuring pollution, and also having this as a credible source.
And since this is educational program, Franz, now we're going to take two interesting business models, not models, but business concepts out of this conversation to kind of break them down and see how they're also relevant for the work of designers. So one of them is incentives, and the other one is externalities. And maybe I'll just quickly jump into something called negative externalities. So this is like business 101 or economics 101. It's one of the things you learn in a business school very fast, very early, which is like your actions or actions of your company could have negative consequences on people that are not even involved in your company. I don't know, like a factory, polluting, they're not paying for their pollution. So basically everyone is paying for their wrongdoing in a way. So factory is benefiting, but everybody is paying these negative externalities. Funnily enough, there's also positive externalities. Like, for example, I don't know, if your neighbor has a insurance against fire, and then maybe fire pops up in your, maybe that's more like a US example, where actually some individuals have these insurance where if there's a fire in your house, firemen actually show up, which means that the fire would not then carry forward to your house. That's an example of positive externality, where somebody else's actions have helped you. But a negative externality is the opposite, and that's what we've been just describing. There's pollution is kind of the prime example economists and business people use to talk about the negative externalities, but they're also all around us in different extents of our business. So when designing products, I think this is one of those really interesting questions, like, is this harming anyone? Is this harming anyone that's not even involved in making a decision of building this or buying this? And as designers, I think we are in a good position to think this through and maybe to bring these questions up, like, hey, how can we maybe avoid this externality for these people and these stakeholders?
Yep, that makes sense. And that was very close to today's topic, right? Negative externalities is we are paying for other companies' pollution.
Yeah.
And this is not part of the price that we are paying at the gas station or at the power plant, for example.
None of us.
We're not paying for the damage this does.
Exactly, none of us. Neither people driving cars and nor the people getting rich with it, selling gas and oil.
Yep. Cool. Second one, incentives. Or rather misaligned incentives is what leads to an inferior outcome. So as soon as there is a situation that there is somebody in a system who works in a direction that is not favorable for maybe the one who gave them this job or other people in the system, this means that there could be a misaligned incentive, because when you look at it from their perspective, it actually totally makes sense to do it. So from the outside, this might seem like wrongdoing, but when you look at it more closely, you see that there is actually rules in place that makes it just logical for this person to or for this body to act in this way. And what we can learn from this, what we just talked today, is that let's say, standardizing bodies, they have a little bit of a misaligned incentive, because what they are asked to do is having these or finding these projects and signing off these projects so that we can all have, or we can have these offset projects so we can reach net zero, right? We're all talking about net zero, and net zero is reached by making this deal. But net zero is not reached by looking back after 5 years and seeing, has this actually worked? So this means that such a company is more focused on making a specific deal, and not so much on, does this really work on the long run? So this also leads to projects that may not deliver. You may have already seen that this doesn't deliver, but it doesn't matter, because the only thing that matters is that you can put a tag on it right now and set off a specific amount of carbon. And that is pretty much comparable to an agency. Let's talk about design again. That's pretty much comparable to an agency that focuses on selling projects only, but then drops the ball when delivering, right? And that usually solves itself, because a company will have bad word of mouth, or they will not have follow-up projects, and the business will decline itself. Meaning that here there is an incentive to actually also deliver and not only sell. But if there is no incentive on delivering, then you will only sell, right? And again, we could have, now make it practical again, we could have this problem if in an agency, sales stuff and project stuff are completely separated. Because in this case, sales stuff will sell something that is not really deliverable, and then we have these misaligned incentives.
Not again, a common situation at all.
No, not at all. So yeah, that's incentives or misaligned incentives, and that's something that's usually pretty much logical thinking, right? Thinking about how do you reward somebody. So that's bonus systems. That's how do people get promoted. That's how do we actually sell something. And when we understand these mechanisms, we can also understand the other side of where would this lead us if we over optimize for that. So in the worst case, this leads to misaligned incentives, which is basically leading us to a inferior outcome, even though everybody is working very logically in the goals direction.
In their best interest. Yeah, so I think what we as designers can take away from this is going into projects and designing things. What can also be designed is incentives, like thinking about who is involved, what their goals are, and not just like users and not just the company, but also suppliers and also like everyone who is affected. That's why we talk about stakeholders over stockholders, because even neighbors of this factory could be affected. Even, I don't know, a person selling it in the shop is a stakeholder that's affected by it. So all of these are really also interesting design challenges. It's hard to get buy-in for those to get to work on it. But if we explain the business sense behind it, I think it can be done. So it's another interesting, like, how might we, align incentives that we can use on projects. Cool.
Nice one.
Do you have anything else? Should we wrap it up?
Watch out for carbon offset projects. Try to learn about them.
Yeah, definitely. And if you have like a favorite one that you really enjoy investing in, maybe just drop it in the comments. So on YouTube under this video for us to know, and to have a look at it also. It will be interesting to see. But if you enjoy this episode, you may also enjoy the dMBA program. Actually, right now we have open applications for the upcoming program, which is beginning with October 10th. And both me and Franz will be mentoring a couple of cohorts, each one cohort. And you may get mentoring directly from us. So applications are open right now, and you can find it on d.MBA/apply. If you're interested, we recommend just filling it out, because there's still like an application call where you can learn more stuff. We can see if we're a good fit for each other. So again, to apply, head over to d.MBA/apply. Thanks, everyone. It was a very nice chat, Franz. And I guess we see each other very soon with another episode.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon.